This is going to be an in-depth and very detailed video on how to rebuild the engine on your 1992 to 2004 Kawasaki KX250 engine. Stay tuned. Like I stated, this is going to be a step-by-step process on how to completely rebuild your Kawasaki KX250 engine. This engine in specific is a 1999, but it will work for 92 to 2004 engines. They are pretty much 95% or more, I would say, very similar to each other. There's some differences in the main exhaust valve assembly, but what I highly suggest is you guys grabbing a manual to work side by side along with this video to help get your engine rebuilt. You will need some special tools along the way to get this engine rebuilt. I'll leave all those tools linked in my description below, but I'm not gonna waste any more of your time. Let's dive into getting this KX250 engine rebuilt. First things first, with an engine build, just make sure you go ahead and lay everything out on the table, making sure that one, you have everything and everything is ready to go, and two, that it's neat and organized, so when it's time to put that part on the bike, you've got it and you know exactly where it is. Before you go ahead and throw the bearings in the freezer and heat the cases up, it's a good idea to lay out your main bearings and your transmission bearings, because you do have to work pretty fast when you use the hot and cold method, so you just want to make sure you know where everything goes, as well as the orientation. Here you see on the left side case here where the retaining clips go, the lip faces up. You don't want to put that facing down because then you can't put the retaining clips in. And then also the main rule of thumb with these engine bearings is the lettering or the text on the bearing is going to be facing up. It's best case scenario if you took a picture of the orientation of the bearings before you took them out, so you know how they go when you put them back in. So with the cases here, if you did get vapor blasting like I did on these cases, thank you to Tyler at Motor Resurgence. It's actually a best practice to take a tap here and re-tap those threads. There is some fine media that does get caught in the threads there, and if you go to put a screw into a screw hole that has media in it, you could either damage the screw or the case itself. So when you do this, it just results in a safer engine assembly. I went ahead and actually separated out the bearings in the left side case and the right side case in the freezer. I put the left side case bearings on the left and then the right side case bearings on the right, so I knew which ones were which when I go to pull them out. In terms of the seals here, before you go ahead and throw the cases into the oven, I got the Pro X crankshaft bearing and seal kit here. These are actually Koyo bearings from Japan, as well as the seals. As much as you can, you want to use Japanese bearings on the inside of your engine. They're just a lot better than the bearings in that are made in China. So we've got the seals here. The larger one is going to go facing up or inside towards the case in the right side case. The smaller one's going to go in the left side case. Again, the opening or the hole in the seal is going to face up. What we can do, since you put the seals in first before the main bearings, we can go ahead and press these seals in and then throw the engine cases into the oven to heat those up, so we can then drop the bearings in after. It's completely safe on these seals because you're really only heating the cases up to about 212 degrees, and these seals can withstand that heat. Now to drive these in, I've got a 36 mil socket here, and this actually fits perfectly on the diameter of the larger seal. So you never want to tap on the inside of the seal. You always want to tap on the outside of the seal. So that's why I got a big flat socket here. That seal will just be tapped in nice and gently, and you're going to tap it in until it bottoms against the crankcase. So I got the left case propped up on some styrofoam here. You can use some 2x4s, wooden blocks, just to lift the case off of the hard table here and protect it a little bit. So what I recommend to get the seals in a little bit easier is some Maxima assembly lube or assembly grease. The grease is actually a little bit better for this situation, but I don't have it. But you can just throw a little bit on the outside here, and then you want to try to drive that seal in as evenly as possible. So take your socket setup and mallet, and you can just lightly tap the seal into its spot. Notice I'm circling the socket to make sure the seal sits evenly in there. When you flip the case over, you would just want to double check that the seal has completely bottomed here on the outside of the case, and it should be pretty flush with where the bearing sits right here on that inner case. And then you'll just repeat the process with that right side crank seal. So we're going to throw the right side crankcase first into the oven, since that's the side that we're going to install the crank on. So I'm going to leave the bearings in there for about an hour or so, and while your cases are heating up, grab your favorite two-stroke oil. Mine's the Maxima Castor 927. I went to the dollar store and grabbed a condiment bottle, And basically we're just gonna throw some 2-stroke oil into the condiment bottle because it's a little bit easier to squirt out. And then once we put the main bearings into the cases, we'll squirt some 2-stroke oil into the main bearings to help reduce the condensation so no rusting happens. And then with the transmission bearings, what we're gonna do is we're gonna use the Maxima Assembly Lube. So we'll squirt the Maxima Assembly Lube, spin it around in those bearings, and that will eliminate the condensation and keep the bearings lubed up for the first dry start. So with the idea behind the heat and cold method, the bearings are supposed to shrink in the freezer while the cases in the oven is supposed to expand the cases, so the bearings should just drop right in. If they don't, I've got this brass punch here, and what you want to do is just tap lightly on the exterior of the bearing, not the inner race. Tapping on the interior of the bearing race could damage the bearing, so you never want to do that. So I've got this as a backup if those bearings just don't tink and drop right in. So to check the temperature of the cases, I've got this infrared thermometer here, and I'm just going to laser around where the bearings go to check the temperature of the cases. And once those things hit 212 degrees or 100 degrees Celsius, you're ready to drop the cold bearings from the freezer into the cases. So you don't have to work really fast, but you do have to work swiftly. You want to take the engine cases out of the oven and then run and go grab the bearings in the freezer, making sure you know which bearings go where. Again, the lettering is going to be facing up on these bearings. And then I've got a set of snap ring pliers that are going to help me grab the bearings on the inner race here, and those bearings should again just drop right into those cases. And when you hear that tink sound, you'll know that they're nice and safe and secure. So it can always be a pretty stressful time doing that, but just make sure you take your time, work confidently and swiftly, and you'll be able to get it done no problem. Okay, then again with your favorite 2-stroke oil, spin that in the bearing, and then same with the assembly lube in the transmission bearings. Nice liberal amount. That'll keep them nice and lubed, ready for the first start. So we have these retaining cap screws here that are going to go on the shift drum bearing. And then I just like to throw a little bit of blue Loctite on them. Get those screwed in and torque down to 78 inch-pounds. And what you want to do is just kind of get them snug first, and then you can go ahead and torque each one of them. And you can flip the case over and do the same thing to the transmission bearing here. A little bit of blue Loctite. And now these screws with the bigger washers are going to go on this side. And then again, these are going to be 78 inch-pounds. Not gonna lie, that's gotta be one of the most stressful things when doing an engine rebuild. Just work swiftly and confidently, and you should be able to get the job done without a problem. It's got a little bit of Caster 927 in the main bearing here, and some assembly lube in the tranny bearings. So we got 3 retaining clips here. 1, 2, careful, these cases are so hot still. 3, and we'll use some blue Loctite on these screws, and we'll get them torqued down to 48 inch-pounds. Now be very careful with these screws. Make sure you have a good grip because these do have a tendency to strip out. And then don't forget the shift drum bearing. Okay, then what we're gonna do is go ahead and take a punch to these screws and plates here so they don't go anywhere. If they do happen to back up, the punch will prevent it from unscrewing anymore. So you just wanna get it on the edge of the screw and plate. Give it a nice little bam. I like to just do 2 in there. Thanks to Tony at Elite Moto Factory for this little tip. But there are your punch marks right there. And don't worry guys, there's plenty. I just checked Rocky Mountain ATVMC. There are plenty of these screws and plates in stock in their OEM section. So, I mean, you really shouldn't have to rebuild the motor after you're rebuilding it right now, but just to have that peace of mind in case you need some more. And this is another tip from Tony as well, but you can take a paint pen, draw on your bearings and the cases. And basically what this is gonna do is the next time you go ahead and take your motor apart, if you ever have to, or the next person, they can tell whether or not the bearings actually rotated inside the case. And if they did rotate inside the case, that means that the cases are too worn past their due date and it's time to get new cases. You can also do it on the retaining screws as well. And then in the right side case here, you've got the governor shaft bearing and the water pump bearing. So just gonna get that bearing installed. And then with the same size socket as the exterior race of the bearing, you just wanna gently tap that in till it bottoms out. And then you can hear the sound change once it bottoms out. And also get some assembly lube thrown on those as well. Okay, and then on this left side case, we've actually got the clutch actuating arm. Now there are two bearings in here. There's one already in there all the way down there, and I never removed it. When I got vapor blasting, I plugged both holes up to make sure no media went down in the hole. However, a couple days later, my conscience ended up getting the best of me. I found a long blind bearing puller collet. I'll leave it linked in my description below to get that bottom bearing out of there. Bought a new bearing for it, and then used the same size socket as the outer diameter of that bearing to punch it back in. But I have a new bearing for the top one, so we're just gonna go ahead and put that in there now. And you just really need to install the bearing far enough so the top of the bearing gets to the top of the tapered section in the case. Go ahead and put some assembly lube in those bearings as well. Push that clutch arm seal in to the case, that'll be pretty easy. On the left side case, you can put in the counter shaft seal. You can do a little bit of assembly lube on the outside as well as on the inside of the seal. And then same process, you want to make sure that goes on there nice and even. I've got this 36 socket that I'm going to gently tap around until it's flush against the top of the case. And again, you'll be able to hear the change in the sound when that happens. Next up is getting the crank installed into the right side case. The crank has been in the freezer chilling for about an hour or so that will shrink up. We're going to use the same heat method, but what we can do is actually just throw the case right back into the oven to heat up that main bearing. And once that main bearing heats up just enough, we can grab that crank from the freezer, put a little assembly lube on the crank there. You can just drop that right in. Just like we did with the main bearings, we can go ahead and throw some 2-stroke oil into the crank bearing there. So now that you got the crank in that right side of the engine, you can go ahead and throw this thing on the engine stand here. I got it at Rocky Mountain ATBMC. Pretty basic engine stand. You don't need anything fancy. There's a lot that swivel and turn and look really cool, but for what we're doing here, this thing gets the job done, and I'll leave that linked in my description below if you guys are interested. Next up, we've got the transmission laid out in front of me on the table. This can be a sticking point for many people, including myself, but not to worry. I just spent a lot of time laying everything out, making sure it's easy to describe so you guys can throw your transmissions back together without a hitch. I have to say thank you to Millennium Technologies. When I took the bike apart, I sent the transmission to them to get isotropic micro polished. Now basically what this is they just polish the shafts and the gears to make it super smooth. It not only results in just buttery smooth shifting, but the idea behind it is to reduce the friction. And when you reduce friction in the transmission, you're ultimately reducing the heat, the amount of heat that your engine is producing. So when your engine is running cooler and doesn't overheat, your engine's actually able to perform at its max capacity for longer periods of time. So that is one of the main benefits of the isotropic micro polishing, and I'm really curious to see how it performs when I throw the bike back together. The people who have gotten this done and who have told me about it, they're like, once you get this done to your bike, you're not going to want to ride a bike without the micro polish you done to it. So thanks to Millennium Technologies. Now in terms of assembling the shafts here, we got the counter shaft, which is where the sprocket goes. So you can see the sprocket goes right on this side here, and the main shaft here is actually what the clutch assembles to. You see I've got all the gears laid out on the counter shaft. First is the biggest, and actually fifth and third are the smallest gears, but normally fifth is supposed to be the smallest amount of teeth on the counter shaft. And the main shaft here, the small gear here is first gear, and then the largest gear on the main shaft is fifth gear, and I've got everything labeled out for you. Now I'll start with the counter shaft first, since there's kind of two components of assembling it. You've got this left side here and you've got the right side. So all the gears right now are face down on the table. When I assemble them onto the shaft, I'm going to take them from face down and assemble them on the shaft just like that. So if you have any questions, I'm going to take a picture for you and you guys can screenshot this picture to make sure everything is lined up correctly. So on the counter shaft here, fourth is going to go on first, followed by second gear, and then third, fifth, and first gear, they're going to get assembled onto the counter shaft from the right side. So third is face down right now. It's going to be assembled up just like that. Now some fun facts actually about these circlips. So these are called stamped circlips. They're actually installed a certain way. There's a rounded side and a sharp side. So the rounded side of the circlip is supposed to be installed towards the direction of thrust. So on this counter shaft here, the direction of thrust is going to be going to the right. So we need to install the curved side towards the direction of thrust. Now the reason that is, if I flip over third gear here, you'll notice how there's a flat side to the end of the gear. You always want the curved curved side of the circlips to go against the flat side of the gears. Reason being, if it was the opposite and the sharp side or the flat side was installed against the gear, that's more surface area for the gear to rub against the circlip. So there's a little bit more friction there. And then again, if we look at the shaft itself, since the circlip is basically going to be thrusted to the right by the gear, you want the flat side to be in the groove, because if the curved side was in the groove and it was being thrusted this way, the circlip could more easily roll over the slot in the shaft. So another reason why we want the flat side installed the opposite way of the thrust, because it's harder to jump that gap in the slot. So I've got all the circlips actually facing down as well. So the curved side is facing up because that's going to go on the shaft face down. Curved side is going to face to the left, and then with the main shaft here, all the flat sides are facing down, all the curved sides are facing up. So the curved side is going to face to the right, and then the flat side is going to face to the left, because the direction of thrust on the main shaft is going to the left. And you'll notice that on each side there's a flat side of the gear here. So flat side gear, curved side of the circlip. This is a flat side of the gear, so curved side of the circlip. And then if I flip over this one, again, flat side of the gear, curved side of the circlip. And then in terms of the shift forks here, we got the smallest shift fork, and it's actually labeled number 2 on the top. This is gonna go on the left side or the main shaft, along with the smaller shift fork pin. So this is actually called shift fork A. Shift fork C is going to be the one that has the large hook here, and this little notch is going to point towards the shift drum because it's going to go in that slot there, and the number is going to be facing down. And then this is going to be actually called shift fork B, so it's got the numbering 249 on top. So that lettering is going to face up. This little pin is going to face to the left to go into the shift drum again. So let's get it all assembled right now. So we'll start with the counter shaft first and put third gear on. So the dog holes are going to face to the left, followed by the circlip here. So curved side is going to face to the left. So with these circlips, there's a little slot in the circlip that you got to line up. And let me tell you guys, there's really no easy way to get these things on. These circlips are replacement parts. So you want to make sure every time you rebuild the transmission that you do replace these circlips. I got all these OEM from Rocky Mountain ATV/MC, and don't worry, they have plenty in stock. Then you've got fifth gear here. So the slot for the shift forks is going to slide into the left. And then you've got first gear here. This is actually marked with a little J on the inside, and the slide that's slotted J is going to go to the left, so the dogs in fifth gear can slide into the dog holes in first gear. Then you've got this needle bearing here that's going to slide right onto the end of the shaft. Then you got this final circlip here that's going to go onto that inside slot right there. Again, the curved side is going to face to the left, and the flat side is going to face to the right. Then the other side of the counter shaft, you got fourth gear, so the dogs are going to go on the shaft facing to the right. And then second gear, the dog holes are going to go facing the right as well. And then also on this counter shaft, there's this collar, so the lip is going to face out, and that's going to go on the shaft into the slot of second gear. And then you have the counter shaft assembly. Okay, so next up we've got the main shaft, and again, fifth gear is facing down. The dog holes are going to face to the left, and that's going to be followed by a circlip. The curved side is going to face to the right. I actually got to flip it around because I can't do the circlip pliers with my left hand. So I'm not gonna lie, these things are a pain in the butt. So when you're doing it, you kind of put your thumb into the circlip on the shaft, kind of hold your thumb there and use the circlip pliers to get it up and over. That's the best way that I can get these things on. I mean, I just spent the last 5 minutes off camera trying to get it on for you guys. And once it's on the shaft, kind of guide it down with your fingers and the circlip pliers as well. And that should snap into place. So I'm going to flip this back around. So if you get confused, the threads are always going to point to the right. Now third gear is face down. I'm going to flip it up and put that onto the splines. So the dogs on third gear are going to go into the dog holes on fifth gear. And then we got a lovely circlip up next. Again, curved side is always going to face toward the gears. And just like the other one, make sure it snaps into place. Then again, threads to the right, fourth gear is face down. The dog holes are going to face right to the dogs. And then we've got one final circlip. Curved side on the circlip is going to face to the right. Now that one went on the easiest. Again, with the circlip, you just want to make sure it's completely seated in the slot around all of the splines. You want to see the splines catching on the circlip there. And then finally, threads to the right, second gear is going to come up and just rest on the shaft just like that. So the shafts are now going to go together like this. So first to first, fifth to fifth, third to third, fourth to fourth, second to second. Now what I'm going to do is, the manual does say make sure the gears are well oiled when you put them in. I'm going to take my Maxima assembly lube and just squirt some assembly lube into each of the sections of the gears. Make sure there's plenty of lube in there to go around. Don't be shy with it. And then especially with the shift forks here, you want to put it in the shift fork slots as well as on the shift fork ears. I'm going to show that to you guys in a second, but I mean, ideally you're going to put engine oil in this thing before you start it, so it's not going to be a complete cold start. But again, don't be shy with the assembly lube because every little bit can help. And then here with the ears of the shift forks, make sure you put some assembly lube on those because they will need some help with the cold start. Do the same thing with the counter shaft here. And then again, don't forget the slots where the shift fork ears go. And I'm also going to put some assembly lube on the shift fork pins. And then on the shift drum itself, especially in the slots where the shift pins go on the shift forks. And then again, don't be shy with the assembly lube. I'm going to put it on the inside of the inner races to make sure those slide in nice and easy. So you're going to put the transmission in as one here. So put the counter shaft in your right hand. Again, this is where the sprocket goes, and then the main shaft in your left hand. Line up all the gears. And then what you can do is just insert the transmission into the engine at the very same time. And you see how the gears are actually stopping. That's perfectly normal. Now we need to get the shift forks in there, the pins, and the drum. So I actually threw the engine on some blocks so it was a little bit easier for you guys to see. We're going to get the shift forks installed. So number 2 here is going to be on the left side. The pin is going to be facing to the right, and it's going to go in the slot right there and kind of move that out of the way. Next up, we'll install shift fork C, the one with the big claw hook, and that's going to go in the slot on the bottom. And again, just get that up and moved out of the way. And then shift fork B with lettering 249 is going to be installed in that slot right there. Again, we can move it out of the way. Next is the drum. This big end is going to be installed down into that bearing. You might need to lift up on shift fork A to drop that drum in there. It's just going to drop into that top slot of the shift drum. You'll move shift fork C all the way on the bottom into the bottom slot. You may have to lift up on it a little bit. And actually shift fork B kind of slid out on me, so I'll have to put that back in. You'll have to lift up on the gear a little bit, and then that'll slide into the top slot of the shift drum. Then with your well-lubed shift fork pins, you can drop the pins right into their slots. Again, making sure they bottom out into the slots in the cases. And then once the shift forks are in there, the transmission should spin freely as you see here. And if the transmission doesn't spin freely like this, you're gonna have to take it apart and figure out where you might have went wrong and then reassemble it with the same process. So I got the engine back in the stand, and I'm just gonna throw some more assembly lube on the gears here, and you wanna make sure that thing is moving like butter. And the isotropic micropolishing by Millennium Technologies is just making this thing move so smooth already. So next up, we got to put these cases together. So I found it's easier to put the cases on blocks for this. And to prep the cases first, what we're going to do is just take some Maxima contact cleaner, spray it on your rag, and then go along the gasket surfaces and make sure everything is nice and cleaned up. There's no oil on the gasket surface because this will make the liquid gasket not stick as well. And again, do it to both sides of the case. Okay, next up we've got 2 dowel pins in the case. One that goes in the right side and then one that goes in the left side here. So it's the worst when these dowel pins get stuck, so I just got a little anti-seize on these dowel pins to help them not stick if I ever go take this engine apart again. So with the KX250 here, there's no gasket that goes in between the case halves. What you need is some liquid gasket. So the stuff that I use is called Yamabond, and it's actually specifically for dirt bike engines. So what we're going to do here is just go around the complete entire outside surface of the cases, and I've got a little paintbrush, and I'm just going to paint this stuff on with a light coating all around the cases. So you want to go completely around the exterior of the left side case, but on the right side case you only want to go around the crank area. And then we can go ahead and put the left case onto the right case. You want to make sure everything goes on as even as possible here. So you're going to be able to get so far because the crank now needs to be installed onto that bearing, and vice versa with the transmission. So what we've got here is a crank puller installer from Tusk, and I'm going to show you guys how to use that. Now with the KXs here, you actually need the separate adapter here to fit on the end of the crank. So I'll show you guys how to use this crank installer to basically pull this case against the other case. You got the special piece for the 99 KX250 that you're going to put down first. Then you got this piece to screw on the end of the crank. Now the hex side is going to face up, so go ahead and get that pretty much screwed on the entire end of the crank there. You want as much thread on that thing as possible. And then what you're going to do is you're going to install this piece and screw it to that bottom collet. You're going to screw that all the way on there. And then there's a little notch here that you're going to slide on the outer piece to, and get that to slide all the way and hit up against the case there. Screw that nut on the top. And then as you tighten this nut down, it's going to pull the crank up and push the case half onto the engine. Now it's super important to make sure the case goes on as evenly as possible here. And then as the cases come together, just double check. Make sure your transmission is spinning freely and smoothly, which this one is, and tighten it all the way down. And before you take the crank puller off the engine, you want to go ahead and take a glance at the crank just to make sure the crank is spaced evenly between the two cases. Most times you need to pull that crank just a little bit more to the left to make sure that crank is aligned evenly in there. It's super important to make sure you check this. I'm sorry I didn't get a better video or picture of it. And then once the cases come together, just double check that the crankshaft is moving nice and freely. It's not binding up, and if it's not, then you've put the cases together successfully. And then the transmission should also be moving freely in both directions. Okay, so for the engine rebuild and actually the entire bike, we've got spec bolt nickel plated bolts here. Basically just a factory looking replacement to the stock cruddy OEM bolts. And also the spec bolts have dimple heads, which is really cool. So we're gonna get these spec bolts in, which is gonna make this motor look a little bit more factory. The longest bolt is going to go in this bottom right part of the motor, and you basically should have just a finger's worth of slack in each of the bolts. And then don't forget to throw your guide on, which will go right here in the top right. So we'll go ahead and put the rest of the bolts in there, all around the exterior, and then 2 on the inside there. Okay, you're going to get all these bolts torqued down to 78 inch-pounds, and you're going to start with the bolts around the crankshaft. Then you're going to continue on with the rest of the case in a crisscross pattern. And then so you make sure you don't forget any, just go around the entire outside of the crankcase, and then you can hit the inner 2 at the very end. But that's going to be a wrap on this video. Part 1 of a part 3 engine rebuild series for the Kawasaki KX250. In this video we talked about throwing your engine bearings in, getting the crank installed, getting the transmission all sorted out and installed into the right side case, as well as getting that left side case installed using the Tusk crank installer puller tool. In part 2 of this engine rebuild series, we're going to be talking about the right side of the engine, getting the shifting mechanism installed with the shift shaft, the idler gear, the kickstart mechanism, the primary gear, the full Hinson clutch install, the Boyson water pump impeller, as well as the left side of the engine, including the ignition and the flywheel. I greatly appreciate you guys watching. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. But I look forward to seeing you in part 2 of this engine rebuild series. As always, ride hard, be safe, and we'll see you in the next video. Peace!